initially about what I think omni-channel really is all about, and some of the things that are important to think about, particularly in terms of the ways that customers are currently reacting to it. So the first thing for me, I suppose, is what do you put in the pot, and what do you believe it actually contains? I am much less interested in dividing the world between digital and non-digital. I don't think that's terribly useful because it's a bit of an arbitrary thing. Voice is often the other side of digital, but in fact, from a technical point of view, it is digital in terms of the way we deliver it these days. So I find it much more useful to talk about the actual modalities of communication, and there really are just three: voice, text, and video. Interestingly, video has, in this contactless era, become a much more prevalent way of communicating, and a very powerful way. So we're seeing that rise. So we're beginning now to see a world in which those three are becoming increasingly balanced. We're also seeing a rebalancing of the way in which we can deliver those services. So assisted service, which is via live assistance, is the most single popular one. And typically, I suppose, assisted service plus voice has been, the default for many, many contact centers over time. But self-service is certainly growing, and we've seen a massive investment in that to be able to try to preserve the capacity of live assistance, particularly during this pandemic and with the rush to have engagement and assistance and help. And we were listening just now to vulnerable customers, and that has again soaked up considerable capacity. So people have been attempting to take away the less complex and push that out through self-service. And some folk who are in the era of machine learning and the ability to predict and see patterns of demand and patterns in terms of topics are now beginning to invest and succeed in being able to anticipate requirement and therefore proactively solve problems before necessarily the customer even realizes and recognizes that they've got them. Now, there are many, many, many different ways in which you can turn that basic recipe, if you want, into ways of engaging with customers. And I suppose the most interesting thing to say is that there really is no such thing as a standard omni-channel mix. It all depends based upon your customer mix, based upon your own generation and evolution. And the other thing to be said, of course, is the way in which we are accessing that service is increasingly changing. And I suppose that the direction of travel is really from left to right. And we are beginning to move away from smartphone or augment smartphone with wearables, still very, very new, but we're starting to hear people like, for example, Sainsbury's beginning to experiment with that quite strongly. There are certain markets where, the Alexas and the Siris of this world are accessible via speakers, either in your home or possibly in your car. And again, there's a huge, huge market, depending which part of the industry that you work in, where sensors and the ability to understand what's taking place either within domestic or commercial environments or industrial environments helps you again create that feedback loop and provides various forms of service on the back of it. So omni-channel is pretty rich. This particular question, well, do certain is extremely important to customers, which is that they want to feel that they've got a choice in terms of the way that they engage with you. And that choice is based on primarily two things. The first one being is what kind of job they're doing, what things they want to achieve, what kind of outcome that they're after. And as this American research shows, there is real variety in the way that people choose to engage. And it's different based upon anything from as relatively simple as updating your address. And again, if you look at the chart there, it's not surprising that a significant number of customers choose to do that in a self-service context, through to possibly more emotive issues, such as investigating a mistake, in which, again, you can start to see that the desire to talk to live assistants is much stronger. And so, therefore, you will find that the different types of journeys that flow through your contact center will attract, from a customer's point of view, different types of channels, which is why that choice is important. The other thing, and possibly the more common one that most people think about, is generational preference. And it has certainly been true. It tends to be a little bit of a stereotype, that younger folk tap and older folk talk. I think that that has been compressed and mixed up to some degree because of pandemic, because our behaviours have been forced to change. And it's interesting to see some of the more recent research that in fact shows that we will gravitate, although we might have personal preferences and have grown up with a certain modality, we will gravitate to channels that we think are the most useful given what we're trying to do. And it is interesting that phone, because it remains a very strong emotive channel, has started to take up some of the slack from the missed opportunity to engage with people face-to-face or in store. And it'll be interesting to see whether that continues to be persistent once we eventually exit lockdown and see how that rebalances. It's also interesting to see that, by the way, that percentage of UK customers are not just the traditional over 60s or over 50s or whatever it's going to be, that a third of a much younger cohort, again, have been drawn to using the phone as an important way of communicating and engaging with brands. So there are two things that are driving the way in which we talk, and indeed the second one, the generational one, does require really quite a lot of persistent research to keep up to speed with actually how your customers are behaving there. You're also seeing, of course, that it's not a question of either, it's or, it's a question of both in many instances. And we've also seen that messaging has finally come into its own. And I say the UK has been probably a little bit slower than other parts of the world to adopt it. But the fact it's asynchronous, you don't have to sit in a queue, is a real material benefit to many people. And of course, the other key point to make about messaging is that whilst you can actually, use WhatsApp over your laptop, it's primarily a mobile form of communication. And indeed, some of the original growth coming out of China and WeChat and stuff, which really has done a lot of the work in terms of showing the art of the possible on messaging, really demonstrates the power of messaging from a point of view of convenience. So all of this really demonstrates an important point, which is when you're thinking about this particular period of time, you have a group of customers who are generally much more disposed to experiment because they have been disrupted in terms of their usual communication patterns. They're open to experiment, and providing you deliver channels that deliver, then you are likely to find adoption much more rapidly than you might have done even just a year and a half ago, because people were much more disposed to stay with their existing habit. But as I said, what's interesting again is we have been dislodged from that. And indeed, because of the fact that customers have experimented, organizations in response to that have changed the way in which they are attempting to operate as organizations and indeed help us engage with customers. And so often quoted, we have seen more change in 7 months than we have traditionally seen in 7 years. And it's a pretty universal thing that what we generally call digital transformation has really gone into hyperdrive. And that really is opening up tremendous opportunity for a pretty significant and profound makeover, which is taking place within customer service. And indeed now, particularly enabled through cloud-based design and delivery, we're beginning to see a much broader one, which is sucking in, back office processes as much as the way in which we engage with customers. And I think this example from Vodafone is typical in a number of respects. It's big and confident in terms of the size of the transformation that they're attempting to make. The prize is huge from their particular point of view, and they are moving from a traditional manual, probably paper-based form of engagement with customers, very much voice-centric, to one where, again, the majority of engagement is held within a digital ecosystem. And also, it means a great deal of those engagements can be automated. And if machine learning and AI is inserted into that capability and there's those kind of instant feedback loops, then again, the ability to predict and to direct is built within that capability. And indeed, virtual assistants tend to now increasingly appear very early on in those encounters, everything from triage to helping decide the routing, and then, if applicable, assisting in both self-service and also helping to assist the advisor and the colleague in desktop terms, in terms of relevant material and relevant workflow. So really, a reimagination of customer service is currently underway in a hugely significant way. Just making my last and maybe most important point that I'd like to say about this is that, so we're seeing a genuine growth of choice. You know, voice is still relevant and will remain so, but it is really losing its dominant position as I said, various forms of text and also video are beginning to compete for customers' attention. And indeed, customers are beginning to realize that there isn't a silver bullet, that they are all good for different scenarios and for different needs at the end of the day. So does it mean, therefore, that if a customer has maybe used 3, 4, 5 channels, it's a sign that you are being successful at omni-channel? And I would suggest that you probably need to revisit that assumption and to think quite carefully about what works from the customer point of view. So many customers use channels not because they wish to, but because they're forced to. And they're forced to because the way in which you've architected those journeys are not successful. For instance, a typical one may well be, I'm on the website, the information you've given me on an FAQ is partially useful, but not entirely. I'm looking for more detailed information. I look around the screen. I notice in the bottom left-hand corner maybe that there's a chat window. I try to use that, but actually it's not available. Behind the scenes, what you've actually done is probably transfer people onto your voice channel because your resourcing isn't quite as flexible as it might be. That therefore means I'm forced to do something else. Time's ticking. I've got to pick up the children. So I might drop something onto social just to alert you to the fact that I have a problem. I'm seeking advice. I check back in again. Nothing's taken place. Dinner, bedtime, bath time takes over. I start the journey again the following morning, maybe with an email, which I might have managed to slip in the night before. Finally, I find, gosh, I know what I'm going to have to do, sit in the queue and talk to someone. So was that successful from my point of view? No, it wasn't. And indeed, if you look at the research, you will find that the most single significant driver of why people tend to move across channels is not because they love it, but it's because they're forced to by the customer service process. And again, a very quick example and a recent example for me with my car insurance company. Indeed, I use the app. It's a good app. But the first thing that happens is when I try and claim, I'm then told that actually that's not available through that particular modality and channel. I've got to get back onto the phone. So it makes you wonder. And indeed, by the way, I can't even trigger that directly out of the app. And it's not seamless as far as the mobile experience is concerned. And therefore you wonder, well, why have you got me to go here? I'm just going back to design to zero again. So that's a fail as far as that's concerned. And indeed, we can still see this, that there is a big discrepancy between the channel that people start with and the one that they're forced to end up with. And it's a real turn-off that if people are trying to be open to new ways of getting service, particularly self-service, if I'm forced at the end of the day through an inadequate and incomplete design to go back to phone, then that's an issue. Now, there are instances, by the way, which are completely legitimate, which is that self-serve can get you half up the hill, but then it suddenly becomes more complex or emotive. And indeed, we want to change that, and we want to actually engage with you live, and we can provide you with a choice as far as that's concerned. But that is through a matter of choice and design, as opposed to the fact that you haven't thought that through. So I would say to you this, buy and invest in technology, but also obviously recognize that you need to re-architect the ways in which those journeys work. And in particular, what you need to do is to focus upon providing choice in the first instance, but thereafter, try to allow the customer to settle into a single journey. And by the way, that should be probably proactively recommended by yourself, that based on feedback and analysis, you happen to know that this particular way of getting that job done really is the best, both for you and for the customer. And you proactively push that, you proactively advise the customer to that end, you can help them navigate to get there. And then you really spend a lot of time drinking your own champagne, making sure that you've designed it, making sure you're feeding back continuously the satisfaction levels, the completion levels, and really understanding that and applying your very best agile and continuous development stripes as far as that's concerned to make sure that thing absolutely works. And that will have the net effect, by the way, of making sure that when people engage with you, that you're on the right side of the consequence of engagement, because there is no such thing as neutral. That is either a little bit more or a little bit less in terms of the strength of that relationship. And indeed, there is significant research that shows it might take just one, couple, or possibly 3 interactions before you as a customer go, that's enough, I really don't need that, I'm going to go somewhere else. And in today's time where everyone's trying to retool for growth, the last thing you want to be doing is losing customers as a result of failing to deliver that. So key point here is that especially as we go into more automated forms of engagement, we really want to make sure that we focus very strongly on effort, which is one of the 3 strands that make up successful customer experience, success and emotion being the other 2. So reducing effort by simplifying is absolutely critically important, and probably in the time that we're in, particularly this last lockdown phase, where I think tempers are short and it really has tested the very last ounce of resilience for a lot of us, it's very easy for us to flip out and get on the wrong side of an argument in a situation as far as engaging. And indeed, if you talk to associations such as the Customer Service Institute and indeed the CCMA, there is considerable evidence that they're picking up now that advisors and frontline staff are becoming victims of extremely irate customers. So it's extremely important to concentrate on removing some of the trigger points for that. Some of the other things that help reduce complexity for both advisor and also for customer, in this particular instance it's the advisor, is that you really cannot do omni-channel if you're going to provide a whole number of different screens and complexities for them to work through. Their attention is distracted, they can't concentrate on the experience. So in today's world, it really is pretty important that you've moved through to unified desktop. All of those separate applications have been brought together. And it's also increasingly important that as far as multi-modal communication is concerned, that is simplified through a single inbox. It depends how you want to then resource it, but you might choose to put that into separate skilled queues, or it might be that you actually decide to multi-skill people, and the fact is that they can move through different modalities at the end of the day. But that's the way in which you can reduce some of that complexity. The other thing that matters a tremendous amount, again, is to think about, as I said to you before, this movement between different modalities and channels. And in particular, your analytics needs to pick up those journeys and where people typically go. Here's a good example. Twitter might only take you so far because actually it needs to be a private conversation, or something changes that necessitates a phone. The worst thing to have as far as Twitter is concerned is to say, here's our telephone number, and essentially you've got nowhere with me, you start at the back of the queue. How can you address that? Again, we are going to increasingly move into a world, I think, of twinning between virtual assistants and human assistants. And again, how is that handover done seamlessly with context, with intent, and indeed made as seamless as possible as far as customers are concerned. And there was another little session I was listening into and seeing the rise of what we were talking about, the chat, SMS, is being increasingly augmented with richer forms of communication. And indeed, sometimes it's appropriate to move just out of a text channel into a richer one, video chat. And again, how's that enabled without a great deal of effort as far as the customer is concerned? Another area, again, where we can reduce effort is by helping to understand the customer. And we're now in an era where machine learning can translate intent in real time and use that understanding to suggest either self-service or indeed to suggest assisted service, and indeed then continue to listen to the customer throughout the whole of their engagement with us. So intent-driven routing is really a sort of iteration and a much more powerful way of looking at doing that. People like Amazon, people like Google, as prime developers and originators of a lot of applications which involve AI, are right on the money in terms of that, and you can start to see some of the things that they've just really quite recently released, next generation of. Agents need the right information at the right time. That same ability to spot intent is now being translated into machine learning and virtual assistants able to find from your various sources of data across the organization, the right information about products and service, and send that across to the desktop. Also provide more context in terms of background data from CRM and other data sources, what that customer is about and what they're likely to need. All of which significantly reduces the amount of effort and pushes the dial away from a more reactive form of engagement to an increasingly predictive and smart one. Again, freeing up advisors to be able to concentrate on the quality of the experience. And again, finally, being proactive, probably one area that absolutely is critical, and I think has been an area which has got worse over this pandemic, is the level of fraud that has been taking place. And this is an example from one of the startup banks, which is really something that we would expect, which simply says, we have, without you knowing it, spotted the fact that something untoward is happening. And a lot of us experience this on our mobile apps, but we have therefore taken proactive action. We've saved you this particular effort and this particular worry. This is how you can resume service, but we've been proactive as far as that's concerned. And there is still significant opportunity within more traditional and less significant and important service journeys, where again we can be proactive, anticipate situations, save the customer some effort, let them know that, and again really be in their good books as far as that's concerned. So those are some thoughts that I've got and for you to consider and think about as far as omni-channel is concerned. The next thing to say is that, of course, a lot of that really now is taking place in a mobile first world. I think that's probably significantly developed, even more so in the last 12 months of the pandemic. And again, I don't know whether you necessarily ask this, but in previous sessions when I've been talking to people and saying, do you actually know what percentage of your inbound traffic is coming over mobile? Far too few people put their hands up and say, yes, we've actually got a handle on that. It's still worth tracking if you're not at 99.9% right now, because there is fundamentally a different opportunity that is open to you if indeed customers are, and probably the majority do, engage with you over some form of smart device and mobile device at the end of the day. Because of course, that device is really both a communication device, but really is a bit of a magic box in terms of what else it can do. And again, some think about this very clearly and produce some really pretty magical experiences through their apps. But again, not enough of us think about what is then opened up to us as far as opportunity is concerned to reinvent service based upon the fundamental functionality that sits within those devices. So I'd just like to share with you, a couple of what I think are sort of really good examples of what can be done in terms of what the combination of service plus the sensors within a smartphone can do. This is actually probably 5 years old now, as an example. It came out over WeChat, and again, it's a really cool service where you can see how many people are sitting in line for a table in the restaurants that you would like to go and visit. You can even grab a number to wait in line without being physically present in the restaurant. That was pretty cool 5 years ago. I guess that's probably something that you would expect and really want to be able to do, especially post-pandemic. And it's all entirely possible through that particular device. If and when we go back to physical retail-based shopping, again, using the fact that we know where you are, you can geolocate things that you're looking for, and you can provide a much more guided and real-time experience for customers in terms of serving their interests and helping them out, allowing them to self-serve. Blended reality is something that I think, increasingly we are beginning to experience. If you look on the right-hand side, that's an IKEA example. And again, some of us may have played with that. Actually, does that piece of furniture sit within my particular room? Well, now you can find that out. Sephora has been very active again for a number of years now in terms of providing a blended reality service around of makeup, virtual makeovers, and again that's grown hugely during lockdown, that kind of service. And again, the other service that you can see on the left hand side here is a virtual overlay whereby I can walk down a particular physical environment and see exactly what I'm looking at in terms of additional and augmented information. So again, all driven by the capacity that I have within my smartphone. And I think one of my last examples is again a very simple but a powerful one, which is whereby if you are going to book via the smartphone and do that as a self-service operation, then once you've booked and paid online, then your room number, door code is texted to you. And again, there's no reason for you to go through traditional reception. you're empowered to be as free to do it as you wish through that particular device. So hotel check-in gets reinvented. And then the other thing to be said, by the way, is think more laterally about the opportunities that different ways of presenting choice is made. It turns out that that actually audio-based choice is pretty difficult for the brain to handle, and we can't deal with very many of them before we forget what the first choice was. And indeed, most IVRs are far too complex for that particular cognitive task. And it turns out that it's much simpler if you can look at it. And you can take existing audio-based IVR and not necessarily do much transformation at all, but once it's available to me as a user where I can visually see it, and I can visually interact with the list through touch, and I can go down into secondary levels of detail, and I can hop back easily to, top level menu, I actually welcome the fact that those menus now are fairly granular. I welcome the fact that I can probably find my particular issue. And of course, the great thing is, by the way, that all of that navigation is visible in real time to the advisor desktop. So again, if indeed I end up needing to talk to a live person, I understand a lot about that customer's journey up front to begin with. So again, think about modality, think about the relative strengths of different ways of engaging. It might be touch, it might be voice, it might still be audio, but think about it from a UX perspective. And again, to the point, we are now on the cusp of a generation that increasingly talks to devices as opposed to any other way. And again, that can be used in terms of navigation. So rather than the complexity of going through those journeys, we're seeing significant transformation in terms of traditional IVR menus, the ability to simply use natural language to recognize intent and get straight there. So that brings me to a conclusion in terms of talking about mobility. I suppose the point that I would just like to dwell on by means of conclusion is to say this, that clearly if you are probably a startup, you would have built yourself an app, you will be thinking probably about a younger cohort, you will therefore have mobile first as your mindset. I would make the point that this is really something that all brands should be thinking about. And indeed, in the last 12 months, it has been shown that older cohorts have definitely changed behaviors in terms of the use of devices. Somebody was talking to me about their mum who is, in her 80s, I think, using her iPad on a regular basis now to order her shopping. So we've gotten used to that. We've seen that the credit card companies have talked about a significant growth in the use of plastic and digital currency during this period of time. So a lot of new behavior is beginning to flow through, and therefore a significant growth in your customer base of people that are now mobile first. And if you start to think about what the mobile device offers you in terms of potential, you can go back to the drawing board and reinvent many of those service experiences in a much more intuitive and a much more creative way that delights your customers. So there's two thoughts really for you: omni-channel, mobile, and opportunities to reinvent against a fast-moving change of consumer behavior. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that has engaged you, although it's towards the end of the day, has given you some ideas to think about. I will now stop sharing and see whether or not that has actually triggered any interest from you in terms of questions. And I'll now revert to that mode and see if we've got any opportunities to have a chat around some questions. Great, I have got a couple of questions already here. So thank you. First of all, from Andrew, how do you predict the adoption of omni-channel chat will perform post-COVID? Are you expecting some fallback or to drive on? I think that chat has certainly got into its stride. I heard a really, really interesting observation from somebody I know just taking over from one of the large online retailers, in fact, ASOS. And he was saying a very, very interesting thing, that they were now in the process of closing down their messaging, because asynchronous certainly has benefit, but in terms of first-time resolution and completion, not so good at the end of the day. Now, I think you also have to put that comment in the context of what they're doing. you know, that kind of online retail business, a very, very large, significant number of people are going, where's my order? What's happened to it? I want to make a return. These are fairly well understood things. And from the brand's point of view, they want to have closure completion as fast as they can. So they have found that for them, actually reverting to chat and scaling chat gives a better experience and allows them to control their queues and backlog much more successfully. In terms of chat versus anything else, I think that chat also, of course, is a medium through which people are also building virtual assistants. And I do see that continuing to grow as people start to activate and turn on those virtual assistants at certain points in those journeys where, again, let's say you were asking, where's my delivery? And you were given the answer to that because third parties like DPD were plumbed into that. And you can see in real time, you know, when that delivery is scheduled to take place. You may well have a secondary question that you actually still requires people. You're going to stay within the modality of chat, but you want to start to talk to somebody. And again, you might request a session. So I think chat, you know, is destined to continue to grow. Although email, if you look at it from an Ofcom point of view, actually remains an outstandingly popular channel still in the UK, surprise, surprise. I do think that in the medium to longer term, you know, chat and or messaging is likely to start to dominate, and certainly for financial services companies where it's almost impossible to securely authenticate email as a channel, then again, messaging and chat have got some real advantages from that perspective. So I think that we will continue to see the rise of chat. Probably in the next, you know, half dozen years, it may well even you know, achieve the same level of volume as with voice at the end of the day. And again, the more broad point about the balance between live assistance and self-service, again, for those organizations that get on with it and are successful there, I would again expect to see a rebalancing of that at the same time. So I hope that gives you some food for thought there. Demi, let me respond to your question here, which is, do you think that given the pace of digital transformation during the pandemic, shortcuts have been taken? Well, I'll say yes right now before I even finish the rest of the question. If so, do you think now is the time for firms to review newly implemented digital processes? And I think that's a well-timed question. Certainly, if you, as I do, spend some of my time on LinkedIn and listening out to what's popular and what seems to engage people's attention, discussing failed customer service experiences has certainly become much more prevalent. And people really do get fairly angry about them, and there seems to be more and more instances. And often part of that conversation seems to involve either automation and or some form of bot, which some people have been saying feels like IVR 2.0 for me getting, you know, what I want at the end of the day. And I think it's almost inevitable that the pandemic caused us to rush to solve problems which are absolutely severe for both employees and customers. And necessarily a lot of the solutions were temporary, they were band-aid, they were shortcuts, they weren't sufficient. You know, everything from the fact that working from home was a temporary fix, oh no, it now looks like it's a permanent one. We've got to go back and professionalize that, you know, make sure it's up to health and safety standards, make sure the technology is robust, all of those kinds of things. I think that a lot of those things are going to get revisited. One of the areas that may well have proved to be right is the fact that service design might not have been as prevalent, research, customer feedback might not have been as deep, and people might not have been as agile in terms of having launched something, listened very carefully to the way that customers were responding, and as a result of that, made sure that they continuously improved and rapidly iterated and improved those experiences. So I do think that some of the work that we've got going forward now will be to go back on some of the stuff that we've built in the last 12 months, make sure it's more robust, make sure it really is much closer to customer expectation, and that it's a firm foundation for the next things that we're going to start to build. So thank you for that. Anybody else inspired to ask a question? If not, I shall take that as a compliment that I've managed to actually answer all of your questions by virtue of the thing that I've gone through. As I said, It is, that very difficult part of the afternoon where, our brains tend to get a little bit lazy, and also our minds get a little bit tired. So I would thank you for taking part in this particular presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And again, I hope that some of the points that I've pushed out here are useful to you, and there are things that you can take away and do something practical with that. I shall bid you farewell from this particular session, but I will also turn up in some of the lounges a little bit later on. And thank you very much for your time and attention, as I said. Good afternoon.